exchanged in Western capitals, and they are not about tariffs. They are about factories being shut down because they cannot get raw materials. Stock markets from London to New York are flashing red. Commodity traders are scrambling. Factories in Germany, France, and the United States are staring at supply chains suddenly running dry. Well, for decades, the West assumed Africa's resources would always flow like an endless river, that they will be cheap, raw, and compliant.
Is the American empire collapsing?
Yes, it is. The question, the key question for everyone to be asking themselves, especially those in leadership, is how fast? And then the second question is, how do we arrest it to a certain extent? You can't stop it. It's impossible. But you can arrest it, and you can build a glide slope down which the empire slides, if you will, because there are...
For Germany's auto industry, it isn't a sledgehammer. It's a tiny switch, smaller than your fingernail. This is the reality inside a Volkswagen plant right now. The production line, a masterpiece of efficiency, is being forced to slow down. Not for a lack of steel or workers, but for a lack of a specific chip from a company called
The United States is part of a group of nations that are were allied. They're called the G7. It's the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. That used to be the powerhouse center of the world in the second half of the 20th century. If you add up the total output of goods and services of the G7, the United States and its major allies, it amounts to about 28% of the total output of our planet. Now I'm going to mention another group, the People's Republic of China and their allies, who have a name. What is the total output of goods and services of the bloc of China and its allies, the BRICS? 35% of world output. That's already a much bigger economic unit than the United States and its major allies. It's over.
For centuries, the West told the world a lie, that Africa was weak, that Africa needed saving, that Africa existed only to supply the raw materials that built Western wealth, Western empires, and Western power. But today those same Western nations are panicking, not because Africa collapsed, but because Africa finally stood up. Across the continent, countries united and issued one declaration the West never imagined they would dare to make: no more raw materials, no more exploitation, no more colonial economics. The reaction in Europe and the United States was instant fear, because deep down they always knew the truth. Their factories, their tech companies, their military machines, their entire industrial supremacy was built on the backs of Africa's minerals: cobalt from Congo, bauxite from Guinea, lithium from Zimbabwe, manganese from South Africa, uranium from Niger. The West never produced these resources, they extracted them. And now Africa was saying, if you want our resources, you buy them processed, manufactured, and priced by us, not stolen, not discounted, not dictated. Suddenly, the same nations that once drew borders with guns were begging for negotiations. Tech giants warned the US government that production would collapse. European auto industries said EV manufacturing would fall by more than half. Banks reported gold shortages they couldn't legally admit to. The West was forced to confront the one reality they spent decades hiding. Africa was not dependent on them. They were dependent on Africa. And while Europe and America scrambled, another global giant stepped forward: China. Not with colonial conditions, not with stolen contracts, but with factories, refineries, railways, and energy hubs built directly on African soil. Together, Africa and China formed the industrial partnership the West feared most. Within months, African-made batteries, African-made steel, African-made microchips and machinery began flowing across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, while Europe watched helplessly from the sidelines. This wasn't just economic change. This was the collapse of a colonial order that survived centuries, a system built on extraction, coercion, and unequal trade. Finally shattered by the one power the West underestimated: a united Africa. Washington calls it a crisis, Brussels calls it a disruption, but Africa calls it what it truly is: freedom. This is the moment colonial economics died, and the world will never be the same again.
It stands at 6.1%, with debt reaching $3.3 trillion. Public spending during the COVID-19 pandemic, soaring energy costs from the war in Ukraine, and a high cost of living are pushing the economy to the brink. Worker unrest, layoffs, and stalled reforms are putting further strain on the economy. Barnier proposed tackling these economic woes with tax hikes and spending cuts, but his use of special constitutional powers to bypass a parliamentary vote.
General Langley, I have constituents that have been scattered across Africa on train and equip missions. So just ballpark, in the last decade, how many Africans has the United States military trained and equipped?
Congressman, I don't have that figure. I can get that figure for you.
Ballpark, just, how many?
Congressman, it would be a wild guess right now.
Seems like something we should know, right?
Over the years, we have trained a substantial number, especially in the Gulf of Guinea states, but including
Like more than 10,000?
It is more than 10,000.
More than 50,000?
I'd say we're reaching around 50,000
Okay.
at least.
And what percentage of the people we've trained end up participating in insurrections or coups against their own government?
Very small number, Congressman. Very small number.
So what percentage do you think?
I'd say probably less than 1%.
But it does happen.
The IMEC program is in force, and we've pushed a significant number through our schools across the.
Yeah, and what data sets do you track to arrive at the conclusion that less than 1% of the roughly 50,000 that we've trained have participated in coups? Because it'd be like about 500, about 1% of 50,000.
Bringing American capital and expertise and standards to Africa so that we can keep exploiting, so that we can exploring where we can get these minerals.
Hit the world with something that really is not anything that people are going to do, and it was shocking.
The global economy was already strained, but nothing prepared the world for the shockwave that erupted the moment several African countries announced a full ban on exporting unprocessed raw materials to Western nations. The decision landed like a thunderclap across financial markets in Europe and North America. For decades, Western economies had built their industries, technologies, and manufacturing empires on cheap African minerals, metals, and agricultural inputs. But overnight, those supply lines snapped, and the ripple effects hit harder than any recession, any oil crisis, or any trade war of the last century. The announcement came as a unified declaration from multiple African governments, coordinated through regional blocs that historically struggled to find common ground. This time, however, there was no hesitation. Africa had reached a turning point. For centuries, the continent had been treated as the world's raw material warehouse, exporting gold, cobalt, lithium, copper, bauxite, manganese, timber, and dozens of other strategic resources without ever benefiting from the true value they generated abroad. While factories in Europe and North America soared, African industries remained stunted. Raw materials left the continent at low prices and returned as high-priced finished products. And so the continent's leaders decided enough was enough. The new policy was simple and non-negotiable. No more exporting raw materials, only processed, refined, value-added goods. The moment the policy hit global news, Western markets reeled. Stock indexes in Europe plunged first, especially in countries reliant on African cobalt, rare earth elements, and lithium for their electric vehicle and renewable energy sectors. Without these critical minerals, factories had no choice but to slow production, announce massive layoffs, and request emergency government support. The sudden halt in mineral supply exposed a truth Western analysts had long ignored. Their green energy revolution depended entirely on Africa's resources, and Africa had just changed the rules of the game. In North America, the panic was even worse. Several industries were already fragile due to global competition, and the new ban shattered whatever stability remained. Technology companies, defense contractors, medical equipment manufacturers, and even aerospace firms suddenly found themselves scrambling for alternative suppliers, but none existed at Africa's scale or quality. Some countries tried turning to South America and Southeast Asia, but those regions had nowhere near the capacity to replace Africa's production, and even if they did, costs would skyrocket. Investors realized this instantly. Shares in major tech and manufacturing firms dropped faster than in the 2008 financial crisis. But what shocked the West most was not just the economic impact, it was the realization of how deeply they had underestimated Africa's geopolitical awakening. For more than a century, Africa had been treated as a fragmented region too, divided to enforce a unified economic position. But in the new era, African countries were coordinating like never before. They had studied global trade patterns, recognized their leverage, and decided to rewrite the rules that once kept them at the bottom of the global value chain. The West accused Africa of triggering an unnecessary crisis, but African governments had a different perspective. For decades, the continent lost trillions of dollars in potential wealth because foreign corporations extracted resources cheaply, refined them abroad, and sold them back to Africa at a markup of up to 800%. Wealth left the continent faster than it was created. Jobs vanished before they could exist. Meanwhile, Western economies grew stronger and more technologically advanced by consuming Africa's resources. In the eyes of African policymakers, the ban was not an attack, it was justice. The new policy forced Africa to invest heavily in its own industrialization. Several countries accelerated the construction of refineries, processing plants, and high-tech manufacturing zones. International partners from Asia and the Middle East rushed in to offer machinery, capital, and expertise. Within months, new industrial corridors emerged across East Africa, Southern Africa, and West Africa, a new class of African professionals, engineers, metallurgists, chemists, and industrial technicians began shaping the continent's future. What the West once dismissed as impossible was suddenly unfolding before them. Europe attempted diplomatic negotiations, urging African governments to reconsider the long-term impact of their decision. But the continent stood firm. European policymakers were stunned when Africa refused to compromise, not even after pressure from trade blocs that historically influenced African policy. But this time, Africa had leverage. Global demand for green technology was rising faster than ever, and Africa possessed over 40% of the world's critical mineral reserves. Any nation that wanted access to these minerals would now have to buy processed goods instead of cheap raw ore. As months passed, the consequences grew. Even more severe, Western manufacturing sectors faced bankruptcy. Electric vehicle companies delayed product launches. Renewable energy programs stalled because they could not secure enough components. Defense industries admitted they lacked essential metals for missile guidance systems and aerospace production. Governments scrambled to subsidize collapsing industries, but the financial burden became overwhelming. Bond markets reflected the stress, and several European nations entered recession simultaneously. Meanwhile, African economies started experiencing an economic renaissance. The continent was no longer exporting wealth. It was exporting products. Instead of receiving pennies for cobalt ore, Africa earned real revenue from refined cobalt sulfate, battery-grade lithium, polished gold, and finished components. Port expansions, railway corridors, industrial hubs, and energy zones increased productivity. The global narrative shifted. Africa was no longer a supplier, it was a competitor. Western media attempted to portray Africa's policy as reckless, but consumers and investors saw something else. A continent finally taking control of its destiny. The story spread across the world, inspiring countries in Latin America and Asia to consider similar policies. The Global South began envisioning a world where their resources no longer flowed cheaply into Western markets. By the time Western leaders realized the magnitude of the shift, it was too late. Africa had already built new alliances, diversified its export markets, and established itself as indispensable in the global economy. The ban on raw materials had not just disrupted Western industries, it had triggered a full-scale economic meltdown across the West and simultaneously launched Africa into a new era of economic power. Africa had flipped the script, and the world was forced to adjust. Africa's announcement reverberated through global trade centers like a sudden thunderclap piercing a quiet sky. The continent's raw materials ban had shifted from a regional commercial decision to a full-scale disruption in the global economic order. Europe, North America, and parts of Asia scrambled to interpret the implications. But Africa was moving with precision and unity. The African Union convened in Addis Ababa within hours of the ban, finalizing new domestic manufacturing goals and regional supply chains that would keep the continent's wealth circulating internally instead of flowing outward. The major shock came when Africa revealed its new mineral pricing model, a system designed to end decades of underpricing by foreign corporations. Historically, companies from the US, the UK, Germany, and France purchased African minerals at fractions of their global market value. Under the new policy, domestic African companies were given priority access to resources, while foreign corporations had to apply for licensing under strict conditions and pay up to 3 times more than before. Overnight, profit margins for Western industries collapsed. In the United States, the automotive and tech sectors were the first to feel the quake. Factory floors in Michigan, Texas, and Ohio slowed as inventory managers reported sudden shortages in cobalt, manganese, and rare earth metals. These minerals, once taken for granted, were essential components of electric vehicle batteries, smartphones, medical equipment, aircraft, and even military defense systems. Executives who had previously dismissed Africa's policy debates now scrambled to renegotiate contracts. They were shocked to find African nations unwilling to bend. The European Union faced even sharper panic. Germany's engineering sector, the pride of Europe, announced production delays of up to 9 months. Italy's luxury car industry warned that without access to African leather, rubber, and metals, its 2026 lineup would be cut in half. France publicly accused Africa of economic aggression, a statement that only deepened tensions and hardened Africa's resolve. But Africa was not acting out of spite. The goal was simple: build, refine, and manufacture within the continent. Angola expanded its crude oil processing capacity by investing billions in refineries that had been stalled for decades. Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya began constructing semiconductor assembly plants. South Africa partnered with Egypt to develop a cross-continental energy grid powered by solar fields in the Sahara and hydroelectric dams in the south. What once seemed impossible became reality as African nations collaborated with China, India, and Brazil, partners who embraced Africa's economic sovereignty rather than resisting it. Western economists attempted to downplay the crisis, but the numbers told a brutal story. European inflation soared to its highest point in 40 years. Energy prices spiked as African nations restricted crude exports in favor of refining domestically. American tech giants reported billions in projected losses due to raw material shortages. Automakers postponed new product launches. Even the medical industry faced trouble, as Africa limited the export of titanium and platinum critical for medical devices and surgical equipment. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings unfolded across Washington, Brussels, and London. The U.S. urged Africa to reconsider, while the EU offered trade incentives and infrastructure funding. But Africa was no longer negotiating from a place of weakness. For decades, the continent had supplied the world's wealth without benefiting from it. Now, with unified leadership and new manufacturing capabilities, Africa finally held the leverage. Panic deepened when Africa announced a new export policy requiring foreign nations to purchase finished African products instead of raw materials. Europe, accustomed to control over global supply chains, realized it was losing a century-old advantage. African-made electronics, vehicles, and batteries began entering Asian markets at competitive prices. Brazil signed a major trade agreement with the continent, boosting South-South cooperation. China expanded its presence, securing joint ventures in mining and technology, further locking out Western interests. In Europe, grocery prices skyrocketed as the ban impacted agriculture indirectly. Fertilizers, chemicals, and packaging materials sourced from Africa suddenly became scarce. Farmers across France and Spain protested in the streets, demanding government intervention. The UK, already weakened by domestic crises, declared the situation a national emergency. Parliament held late-night sessions trying to craft rescue mechanisms for industries collapsing under the new economic pressure. Meanwhile, in Africa, the streets buzzed with optimism. Job creation surged as new factories opened. Local processing plants in Tanzania, Zambia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo turned raw minerals into value-added goods. Youth employment climbed to its highest levels in decades. The narrative had shifted. Africa was no longer the world's supplier of cheap resources, it was becoming a global industrial force. Western media outlets criticized the shift, labeling Africa's policies as hostile, irresponsible, and radical. But African leaders responded with calm clarity. They argued that Europe and the US had dominated global trade for centuries, extracting wealth while leaving Africa underdeveloped. Now Africa was simply choosing to benefit from its own resources. The crisis escalated further when the African Union announced a continent-wide currency for mineral trading. This currency, designed to reduce dependency on the dollar and euro, sent shockwaves through global financial markets. Western stock exchanges plunged, the dollar weakened, investors panicked, predicting massive long-term instability. Yet, despite the chaos, Africa maintained steady progress. Infrastructure projects flourished under new partnerships with Asia and South America. High-speed rail lines connected port cities across East and West Africa. Solar megaprojects lit up vast rural regions previously left in darkness. Universities introduced new engineering and technology programs to support the manufacturing boom. What stunned the West most was Africa's unity. For the first time in modern history, the continent moved with a single purpose and a unified strategy. Countries that had once competed for foreign contracts now collaborated to maximize collective growth. This unity gave Africa unmatched bargaining power, and the West found itself negotiating from a place of desperation. By the end of the first year, analysts confirmed what once seemed unthinkable: Africa's raw materials ban had triggered the worst economic crisis the West had seen in generations. Entire industries were paralyzed, inflation was skyrocketing, and political tensions were rising fast. But for Africa, it was the dawn of a new era, a moment of economic liberation after centuries of exploitation. The shockwaves from Africa's raw materials ban continued to ripple across the globe, but the deepest tremors were felt in Washington and Brussels. Economists who once dismissed Africa as a supplier continent were now scrambling to understand how a single policy shift could unseat the economic balance that had favored the West for centuries. Yet the explanation was simple: Africa had finally recognized the true value of its resources and the unstoppable power of unity. In the United States, political tensions erupted as competing factions debated how to respond. Agricultural states blamed the tech sector for over-reliance on African minerals. Tech giants blamed the government for ignoring years of warnings about resource dependency. The military worried about shortages in rare earth metals needed for jets, satellites, and communication systems. For the first time in decades, America found itself vulnerable not because of war, but because of supply chains it had taken for granted. Factories in California and Arizona reported production slowdowns in microchips. Without access to Africa's cobalt and palladium, even the most advanced fabrication plants faltered. The U.S. attempted to turn to alternative suppliers in Australia, Canada, and Southeast Asia, but the limited quantities and slow extraction processes made them unreliable. Meanwhile, African nations doubled down on their new policies, refusing to buckle under Western pressure. Europe faced an even harsher reality. Leaders in Brussels held emergency summits every week, attempting to soften the economic blow. But as the ban continued, energy shortages worsened. Industries dependent on African oil, lithium, and rubber faced massive budget overruns. Some European factories shut down entirely, unable to survive the new pricing model Africa introduced. In Germany, auto manufacturers, symbols of the nation's engineering pride, announced that without African minerals, electric vehicle production would plummet by nearly 60%. This revelation sparked panic among investors and citizens alike. Protests erupted in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg as workers demanded answers and security for their jobs. But Africa was not acting in isolation. With newfound confidence, the continent strengthened ties with China, Brazil, India, and the Middle East. These nations welcomed Africa's industrialization, offering advanced machinery, engineering expertise, and long-term investment. China, in particular, accelerated joint ventures to build state-of-the-art refineries, battery plants, and steel manufacturing complexes across East and Southern Africa. This unexpected collaboration infuriated the West. European leaders accused China of enabling Africa's economic aggression, while U.S. officials criticized the continent for destabilizing global supply chains. But Africa's representatives were unmoved. For the first time in modern history, they spoke with one voice. They argued that the world had benefited from Africa's generosity for too long, and now it was Africa's turn to enjoy the wealth buried beneath its soil. As African nations advanced their industrial capabilities, they also restructured internal trade systems. A new continental railway network dubbed the Golden Loop connected major ports and mining regions. This network slashed transportation costs and boosted inter-African trade, creating a self-sustaining economic ecosystem. Ports in Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa expanded rapidly, handling shipments of African-made electronics, construction materials, and machinery destined for Asia and South America. This transformation startled Western analysts. They had always believed Africa lacked the infrastructure and coordination to challenge global markets. But the ban had ignited a spark, a unified purpose that transcended borders, languages, and histories. Within Africa, the economic boom was visible everywhere. Local markets thrived as new factories hired thousands of workers. Solar farms stretched across the Sahara, powering new industrial hubs. Rural regions that once lacked stable electricity now had modern roads, schools, and hospitals built through new revenue streams generated by local manufacturing. Youth innovation surged. Tech incubators in Nigeria, Rwanda, and Egypt produced groundbreaking inventions, including low-cost electric vehicles, durable mining robots, and advanced agricultural sensors. These innovations soon made their way into the global market, offering affordable alternatives to Western products. Africa's decision to halt exports had created something the world had never seen before, a continent determined not just to supply global industries, but to lead them. Meanwhile, the economic meltdown in the West reached new heights. Stock markets in the UK and Germany suffered historic drops, pension funds lost billions, consumer prices rose sharply, and small businesses collapsed under the weight of expensive imported goods. Even military budgets were strained as the cost of essential minerals skyrocketed. Western media outlets portrayed Africa as reckless and irresponsible, but their narratives only fueled resentment within African populations, who remembered decades of exploitation, cheap contracts, and unequal trade deals. The ban became a symbol of empowerment, a declaration that Africa would no longer be the world's silent engine of wealth. International organizations attempted to intervene. The IMF proposed emergency negotiations, while the World Bank offered loans to Western nations to stabilize their industries. But Africa was no longer in a position where outside institutions controlled its economic fate. The continent had alternative partners and, more importantly, alternative strategies. One of the most dramatic shifts came when Africa revealed its long-term plan, a global marketplace for finished African goods, backed by the new continental currency. This marketplace offered competitive pricing that undercut Western manufacturers, who were already weakened by resource shortages. Asian and South American nations flocked to Africa's new trading platform, eager to access high-quality products made directly at the source. The West tried to retaliate with tariffs and sanctions, but the impact was minimal. Africa had spent years preparing for this moment, gradually decreasing reliance on Western financial systems and building internal resilience. Even when major Western banks attempted to restrict African transactions, the continent simply rerouted through alternative networks built in collaboration with China and the Middle East. By mid-year, Europe's economic crisis had reached a breaking point. Industries were failing faster than governments could rescue them. Citizens demanded answers, protesting outside parliaments. Many called for a complete restructuring of relations with Africa, urging leaders to negotiate from a place of respect rather than dominance. In the U.S., political leaders were forced to confront a reality they had long ignored: America could not sustain its economy without Africa's resources. Talks about reinventing domestic mining resurfaced, but experts warned it would take decades and trillions of dollars to match Africa's scale. The world was witnessing a historic shift, one that textbooks would someday describe as the moment Africa reclaimed its power. A moment when a continent long undervalued took control of the very resources that fueled global prosperity. And as Western economies teetered on the brink of collapse, Africa stood stronger than ever, backed by industries it had once dreamed of and partnerships it had once been denied.